Hello everyone, and we are back for another chapter call for the fanfic. The Asha chapter is coming along. I'm sorry it's been delayed so long. Part of the delay was of course Cersei, but part of the delay was things happening in my life and the world. A lot of my plate has been cleared, so some time will be given to Asha again. Which brings us to Davos, a chapter I've been dreading for a long time. Thinking of a story that actually makes sense in the plot, is dark, shocking, includes some fan theories, and is thematically consistent with Davos, is tough. Also, I simply didn't want 5 or 6 Davos chapters. Being economical is also an issue. That said, I'm letting this chapter be rather long. There's a lot of story to tell. I'm setting a guide of 6,000 to 7,000 words, but who knows what'll happen. So let's try to get this story sorted and talk about the challenges we have. So as I've talked about before, the Davos story is very hard to handle with regards to the timeline. Davos disappears about a third of the way through A Dance with Dragons, and importantly, the so-called Hooded Man appears in the Ghost of Winterfell chapter at about the 2/3 point. Now there are plenty of theories on who the Hooded Man is, and none are perfect. The Hooded Man needs to be someone who can recognize Theon even after his abuse, but also be surprised by his abuse. So he's probably a northerner. Let's remember that Theon traveled with Ned all over, but not someone who is already in the castle. Also, he needs to be a character who would get past the Umber army outside, but also the Bolton army at the gates of Winterfell. That is, he needs to be perceived as a fence sitter. And if we're going with the Theon Kinslayer theory, that needs to fit too. So I would say that the Hooded Man being Robert Glover makes the most sense. I get that he isn't perfect, his children are hostages of the Ironborn, and he should be focused on getting Theon as a hostage to trade. And we see that the Hooded Man grabs his dagger and seems content with Theon being tortured more by Ramsay. But I think these problems can be explained away, and I don't think there's anyone better than Robert Glover. Not to mention the Hooded Man seems to be bringing news, which seems to trigger Mance's action, and the news makes Manderly act suicidal the next morning, so let's just assume that the return of Rickon is that news that causes the action. Which, if true, is rather constraining for the Davos story considering travel times. Rickon needs to be found and delivered pretty early in A Dance with Dragons. This means that Davos needs to leave White Harbor around the time that Wyman Manderly does. Manderly then slowly makes it to Barrowton, and in the name of simplicity, let's say that Davos makes it to Skagos around the same time. That is, Reek 3. And then from there, assuming Stannis and the Boltons head to Winterfell around the same time, we know it's about 50 days until the arrival of the Hooded Man. But then we need to subtract some travel time for Robert to get to Winterfell, so I don't know, 20 days. All in all, locating Rickon and having him and Robert leave Skagos need to happen in about a month or less in the middle third of A Dance with Dragons. Which means Davos 1 must either have a flashback or cover a long period of time, much like the King's Prize chapter. Or both. We must have Davos get Rickon, send him off, and then have events catch up with the rest of the story. And so, to fix all of these timeline and plot issues, this is what I've come up with. Keep in mind, this is Skagos, so things are going to get dark and weird. You may not like what I'm doing here, you may love it, but it's dark and weird. The setting of the story is almost entirely at King's House, the seat of House Magnar. And I'm placing King's House in that northern bay. I understand there are maps out there that show it in different locations. Those aren't canon. So, the story begins with Davos being commanded to fulfill his lord's duty to the First Knight. The Magnar has not been able to perform his duties in these past years due to his condition, and Sir Robert is no lord. So that leaves Davos, the Lord of the Rainwood, to take on that role. And so we begin with Davos laying down to bed a newlywed Skagosi bride. That's right, we're getting sex and unicorns. We are breaking the J.K. Rowling rule, which is exactly what George R. Martin wanted. And what we want here is a very creepy atmosphere. The room is underground, but moonlight shines in from the sunken windows. Outside, Davos can hear the snorts and brays of unicorns. Throughout the walls, the roots of weirwoods have penetrated, and carved into the pale roots are hundreds of tiny faces, so that thousands of eyes are watching him. Davos fumbles with the bride, a homely woman who smells of peat. His missing fingertips make it hard to undress her. And of course, he feels guilty about his wife Marya. He hopes that one day she will forgive him, and he hopes that the mother will forgive him. To violate the bonds of marriage was an insult to her. He remembers how he let people burn her and the rest of the seven on the beaches of Dragonstone. His gods of flame. Was there anything worse than that? When Davos is inside the bride, wet and warm, he remembers the humid summer where he met Marya, and briefly tell this story of their meeting. Perhaps Davos was smuggling woodworkings for her father. Make it a sweet story. He imagines her face, her straight brown hair, how in the sunlight it almost seemed red. And then her face shifts to that of Melisandre, just as he climaxes. He pulls out and imagines green wildfire seeping from the vagina. Then the liquid leaps onto his body and spreads. It covers him, covering his mouth and nose. He's drowning. He screams, but the only sounds from his throat are the cries of Allard and Mathos and Merrick. And then Davos loses time and finds himself wandering the tunnels of King's House, trying to find his way back to the feast. Beneath the earth he's unsure of the time, but he can still hear the sounds of merriment echoing through the halls. The Magnar had given him freedom of the castle. After all, there was nowhere to go. The Magnar controlled the only port off of Skagos. And next we explain how we got here in the story. They had taken a small cog and a dozen men along with Sir Robert and the boy Wex, bound for Driftwood Hall. Back at Newcastle, Wex had clapped his hands loud to get the men's attention and snatched a cup made of driftwood off the table. The wildling woman and the Stark boy had fled there. He had overheard their plans when hiding in his tree. The Stains of Skagos were the only Skagosi to trade with outsiders, but it was a difficult ordeal to do so. Driftwood Hall looked over a rocky cliff, its waters perilous, so larger ships would drop anchor 10 leagues to the west and send skiffs up a river there. The river would bring traders within 5 leagues, and they would make the rest of the journey on foot. It was a dangerous journey, though, as the mouth of the river had been claimed by House Kroll, and its men would prey on traders in the forests. The black-sailed Manderley cog was small enough to navigate the river, and they slipped in the night unseen and made their way up. They made it to Driftwood Hall just as snows began and the temperature dropped. After a grueling return to the cog, they found that the river was too filled with snow and ice to navigate. The blind bastard would say that a smuggler's life was 9 parts dicker to 1 part tricker, and Davos found that to be true. Bribes and deal-making was how most goods moved in and out of port, not on a smuggler's skiff. He would need his smuggler's tongue to get off the island. The only waters that wouldn't be frozen would be the North Bay of Skagos, its port controlled by House Magnar. Returning to the present, Davos finds himself at the farewell feast. And here we get some George R. Martin food descriptions. We need lots of creepy descriptions here. Bloody unicorn steak, black slimy mushrooms, unicorn cheese, grubs and worms. Davos will be relieved that there's no human flesh, as far as he can tell. Rickon Stark is gnawing at a bone, his direwolf off in the kennel. Robert Glover is staring at a wax tablet that Wex has written on. He looks troubled. Osha glowers, watching the room with suspicion. Davos then sits between Sir Robert and the Magnar. The Magnar is an obese man with pale, milk-colored flesh. He's unable to walk without assistance. He is bald save for a few wisps of red hair. His eyes are red as well, bloodshot. He shovels acorn pudding into his huge mouth. Davos had been successful with his negotiation with him. King Stannis and Lord Rickon Stark would claim no taxes or incomes on the Isle of Skagos for 10 years. Further, a ship filled with Dornish blood oranges would be gifted every 3 moons, and Lord Davos Seaworth would do his duty this evening. It wasn't a right on Skagos, it's a duty. And Davos agreed that a different lord would travel to Skagos to do duty every year. The Magnar was quite insistent on this. It wasn't negotiable. In return, Skagos would declare for King Stannis and provide safe passage to Eastwatch for Rickon Stark, Lord of Winterfell. Further, the Skagosi would provide 1,000 swords and 100 mounted men for King Stannis in his current war. House Kroll of Deepdown held some survivors from Aledo and Old Mother's son as well. They would be freed. Davos will say that his duty is done. He thanks the Magnar for his hospitality, but he looks forward to returning to his king. The Magnar will explain that Lord Rickon and his companions will leave on the morning tide, But Davos is to remain a bit longer. They must ensure his seed has quickened. When the girl lacks moonblood, then and only then will his duty be fulfilled. In fact, he says it may be best if Davos tumbles the bride tomorrow and the day after to ensure she gets with child. Davos' heart sinks, but he tells himself that the weight is nothing compared to what he's already sacrificed. He thinks again of his gods of flame. The Magnar will then toast the crowd, and we need a really screwed up speech that twists the words of Bloodraven and the Children of the Forest. The Magnar will say that winter is soon upon them, and now it's time for them to go into the stone, into the earth. As the cold winds rise, they will be warm and safe amongst worms and roots. As the Magnar, he is their guardian, and will become the tree, their green seer. Our offerings will abate the cold, he says. Let us sleep and dream of spring, when we shall be born from the stone anew. Everyone drinks. After the feast, Osha arrives at the chamber that Davos, Robet, and Wex share. She tells Davos that they need to go for a walk and he should bundle up. As they head above ground out into the snow, Davos needs to describe King's house. The castle is mostly underground, built beneath a grove of weirwoods. As they exit from the main entrance, they can see dozens of trees staring at them in the moonlight, unicorns grazing among them. They walk and Osha will explain her story. She'll say that her sister, Haley, had a plan for getting south of the wall. They would romance some Night's Watchmen and get them to figure out a way south for them. Osha, in truth, thought it was a dumb plan. Getting a man to share your bed is easy, but romancing them and getting them to do what you want is a bit harder. But she went along with it anyway, and so they flagged down some rangers next time they spied them. Stiv and Wallen were their names. Haley romanced Wallen, Osha romanced Stiv. He wasn't all that bad. And it was easier than she thought. He was looking for romance. He wanted to be a hero protecting his lady from the dangers that came in the night, like he was some southern knight. Davos and Osha come to the port, where men are preparing a ship for tomorrow. They then keep walking along the water. Osha continues her story. After some time, they get Stiv and Wallen to arrange a boat that would take them the long way around Skagos, keeping clear of the eyes of Eastwatch and Cotterpike's ships. They stopped at Driftwood Hall. The Stains are a generous people, but even they were nervous to keep free folk and deserters around too long for fear of Winterfell's wrath. But something else made them more nervous. Something that made all Skagosi nervous. Then Davos and Osha come to a rock formation, half again as tall as a man. It's an arch, a jagged thing with rocks jutting inward like teeth. Before it is a small stone altar with runes scratched into its base. Osha will ask Davos if he knows what this is, and he will ask, "Is it an arch?" And she will correct him that it's a gate. She asks if he knows what's beyond them waves, and Davos stares through the rock formation, looking out at the ocean, and answers, "North of the wall?" "Aye," she says, "the Magnar's men sail from here, and they land north of the wall. The free folk have seen their sails." Davos will say that he doesn't understand. Osha will explain that there is a man north of the wall named Craster. The free folk shun him as he marries and beds his daughters, but Stiv said there was something worse about him. He would give his sons to them. Davos looks down at the altar and remembers the Magnar's words. Our offerings will abate the cold. When Davos returns to his chambers, he finds that Sir Robet and Wex are already asleep. Beside Wex is the wax tablet that he had been writing on. Davos picks up the thing and reads it, wondering what Wex wrote that was troubling Sir Robet. Kinslayer. Weeks pass. It's a lonely time for Davos without his companions. Davos spends his days wandering the halls of King's House, walking amongst the weirwoods, walking along the port. The Master of Unicorns teaches him to ride. The man is the bride's husband, but he has yet to better. The women of King's House show him how to forage for mushrooms, which are poisonous, which are edible, which can be used to extract oil from. The cooks show him how to make acorn mash, and acorn milk, and acorn pudding, and how to render oil from the fat of unicorns. The survivors from Aleda and Old Mother's son are eventually delivered to King's House. It's fewer than he expected. Only a score, and they look thin and sickly. And then one day, the Magnar announces that he is certain the bride is with child. He gives leave for Davos and the Cell-Sails to depart for Eastwatch. In the morning, an honor guard escorts Davos and his men towards the port. The Magnar is carried by palanquin. He speaks of how the friendship between the Skagosi and King Stannis is strong, and he hopes that one day Stannis can visit Skagos for himself. And then they see the smoke. "The werewoods!" the guards yell. They panic, dropping the Magnar, and go running towards the grove. Davos follows, but as the men head towards the burning trees, Davos heads for the entrance of King's House. People are streaming from the different entrances of the castle, holding buckets with water, anything to put out the fire. Davos knows that putting out the fire won't come easy. Not with the wood soaked with acorn oil, and mushroom oil, and unicorn oil, and the branches filled with dung. Davos heads downstairs, runs through the hallway, and finds the bride's chambers. He opens her door and finds her afraid inside. He grabs her by the arm and yanks her to come with him. They yank her outside, and Davos continues to pull her towards the port. She realizes something is wrong and begins to scream. He tries to cover her mouth, but she bites his fingers and scratches at him. Blood streams from his face and fingers, but he's able to pick her up off the ground and begins to run. They pass by the Magnar on the ground. His throat had been slit. He makes it to the Magnar's ship, where the Cell-Sails have taken control of it. All but a single ship are aflame. An arrow flies into Davos' thigh. He runs down the gangplank with the girl and tosses her onto the ship. A few more arrows hit the side of the hull as the ship leaves port. As the ship pulls away from Skagos, Davos watches as their gods burn. And there we are. Good luck writing, and we'll see you next time.